Yay.
So first of all, thanks you all, Russell and Donald.
It's our pleasure.
What?
It's our pleasure.
For having me. So an added benefit of this is that I've never actually been in the Bay Area before, and I got to do the drive up yesterday, which was absolutely beautiful. So that was an added bonus. So as Russell said, initially I trained very traditionally at the North Bennett Street School in Boston, which is not an art school or design school at all. It's a trade school, actually, where you learn to build sound furniture in the traditional way, basically by studying 18th and 19th century early American and European forms and looking at those structurally to learn to build furniture. And then about 10 years after that, after working independently as a furniture maker, not only doing that, not making my sole living that way, always waiting tables or bartending along with that, I decided that I had an art background. As an undergrad, I focused in textiles. So I'd always had grad school in the back of my mind, but I thought I would get an MFA in textiles. But then after I switched to wood, I still kept that sort of idea of grad school in the back of my mind. So eventually, I realized that I didn't want to just continue making what other people wanted me to make, and that I wanted my work to be more of an intellectual pursuit. So I decided to go to grad school and do the MFA in wood. And then, as it turned out, where my work went conceptually, I ended up doing so much historical research that it made sense to go ahead and get an art history degree. So this talk actually starts with my sort of journey toward switching to furniture as my medium. And for me, that was kind of an epiphany experience. I was in Boston, and I had gone to see this pivotal exhibition called New American Furniture, which, Donald, did you have a piece in that?
No, I was stuck in Australia at that stage.
Okay.
I wasn't in New America.
It seems like you should have had a piece in that. So some of you probably know what that was, but it was this pivotal show where the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston invited, I don't know how many furniture makers now, at least 20, I was going to say 20, but so maybe 24 contemporary furniture makers to look at the historical collection that the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston had and make a contemporary piece inspired by an historical piece. So someone had mentioned North Bennett Street School in Boston to me. There was a Sam Maloof show in town, so I had started thinking about wood. And so there was this, fantastic show at Boston, so of course I went to see that, and I was absolutely blown away by what I saw in wood. I had no idea that you could make contemporary pieces in wood like that. I had seen a lot of antique furniture. I had been around wood a lot. My father's a carpenter. My grandfather had been a carpenter. My brothers all trained as carpenters. So I was around home building a lot. So wood was a very familiar material, but I had never seen anything like these things made. And one chair in particular there I was quite enamored with, and that was Michael Hurwitz's rocking chaise. I just thought it was an incredibly beautiful form, exquisitely made, and there was a little tiny picture in front of it of the Samuel Gregg chair that it was based on, and I think at the time I didn't pay that much attention to the Samuel Gregg chair. But then I started, I was really turned on by wood, and I started getting more interested in this North Bennett Street School, and it made a lot of sense to me to go there because I didn't have any woodworking skills. So I felt like I couldn't just, go back to art school in wood. So what made sense to me was to first get these sound skills under my belt. And since North Bennett was right there, and it was this amazing school with such a great reputation, I decided that that would probably be a good thing to check out. So I went to a student show of North Bennett Street work shortly after I had seen this new American Furniture show, and that show was filled with reproduction furniture made by the students there. And this was a chair by Tony Hayden, who's actually in the audience tonight, who lives in the Monterey area and works as a custom furniture maker. He had made this reproduction of the Grag chair. And so I went to that show, and again, I was completely taken by this one piece in particular. I thought this, again, was this really exquisite form. I couldn't believe how contemporary it looked for being a reproduction of such an old chair. And then it wasn't until I did a little bit of investigating that I realized that Tony's reproduction was of the same Greg chair that the Michael Hurwitz chair was inspired by. So somehow having all those three chairs sort of come into my radar screen at the same, within like a period of 1.5 or 2 years, was sort of an epiphany moment for me that I couldn't walk away from. So that was what sort of solidified this decision to switch mediums and switch from textiles to furniture. And it's been really interesting to me now, again, like 6 years later, after finishing the MFA, excuse me, and then deciding to go on and get the art history degree in early American furniture and material culture. I now realize that those three different chairs had another, there was sort of another thing going on with those, and now I make sense of my current practice, actually, by thinking of those three chairs and thinking of Tony's chair as sort of the traditional training part of my practice, and then going on and doing the MFA and adding, thinking conceptually about work and turning my medium into a vehicle for making art, and then going on and adding the art history degree. And so I have these three branches of my practice now that I can sort of think back to those three chairs with, but in my everyday practice, I don't separate them out that way. They really feel like part of the same thing, and that all these different aspects of my practice currently inform the others. And I was just sharing with Donald, and I talked to Russell a little bit earlier, is that I still first and foremost identify myself as a furniture maker, even though you'll see in the rest of the slides I show that my most recent work is not necessarily what you would call furniture, and it's more sculptural work that references early American furniture forms. But I really feel that training and the way that my medium is steeped in this history of utilitarian objects really has to do with what I think about conceptually, and I think that craft and mediums that require a great deal of skill and really knowing your materials have a unique thing to add to the art world. And I also think that perhaps we're headed for some kind of paradigm shift in the near future where that uniqueness of those mediums and of what we do as crafters will have a lot to do with the way we shift our thinking. So anyway, I'm still, even though I've had a lot of intense and even at times I would say argumentative discussions with some fellow artists about my continuing to identify myself as a furniture maker, I stand my ground, and I do, that identity is really important to me still. So I'm just going to go through my journey a little bit. So I'm showing a few early pieces. So what I learned to do at North Bennett Street School was the MFA was such an amazing resource because it had all this amazing historical furniture, and the school had a great relationship with the museum. I think it still does, where students were able to go in there and with the help of one of the museum curators really investigate a piece of furniture. So the curators would take the piece out of its place and turn it upside down. They'd let you measure it, take photographs of it and stuff. So we got to really study those forms and then go back and do detailed full-scale drawings and figure out how it was we were going to make them. And so this was the chair that I fell in love with at the museum and wanted to make as my chair project at North Bennett. But because I had this art background and I never wanted to just make reproduction furniture, I felt like the reason that I went that route was to gain the skills that I thought I needed. But I still wanted to not make exact reproductions of anything, so I had to tweak it a tiny bit. So the chair that I ended up making was this. So I changed the materials, I changed the splat a little bit, so the intersecting ovals became sort of Gothic arch form instead. But still very much a federal style chair. And then I went on to make lots of arts and crafts style furniture in the decade that I worked as an independent furniture maker, and got a lot of commissions for stickly-ish pieces. And it was that kind of thing where, you know, a lot of arts and crafts style stuff had marquetry inlaid in it. And that became this little creative outlet for me. And so it was the situation where not everyone wanted to pay me to have some marquetry inlaid on their piece, but you know, sometimes I'd just go ahead and do it because I wanted to have it in my portfolio, and I also recognized that I wanted that creative outlet. So even though this piece is a pretty exact reproduction of a settee that my client found in a book and said, "Will you make this for me?" I got to do my own thing a little bit with the marquetry on the front. Yeah, so this was all still in Boston. So this is just another one of those pieces where it's sort of green, stickly meets green and green, because the client I had a lot of stickly-ish arts and crafts furniture. That settee was for him, and then he came out here and went to Pasadena and saw the green and green houses and came back and wanted green and green stuff, but it still had to be an oak because that's what he was redoing his condo in, and so this was what came out of that. And so a little design work in there, but still very in keeping with, you know, it didn't feel that much like my own work or my own design because it was so in keeping with the traditional style. And then a few things that were very contemporary pieces. Again, I didn't actually design this piece. This was designed by architects in Boston who then came to myself and the guy that I was renting shop space from and said, "Can you build these pieces for us?" So lots of fancy veneer work and quilted maple. There's solid, that's a mirror in the back. This is when digital photography was just, people were just starting to use it. And I can't remember what the photographer did. I can't remember what was in the mirror that shouldn't have been. So anyway, he badly photoshopped but that was a mirror back there. And again, this was really satisfying work at times. I mean, there were always those complications in working with other people and doing other people's design, but still there was still a level of intellectual exercise that my work didn't have that I really wanted it to have. So eventually, it was shortly after this that I decided that I was, in fact, going to go on to grad school. So that's when I ended up going to UW-Madison to work with Tom Loser and do my MFA in wood there. Oh, I forgot. This is the matching table that goes with that sideboard. So I was in charge of the sideboard, and Dan Klein, who I rented shop space from in Boston, was in charge of the table. And because they were so large, and you can imagine veneer work, I mean the layup for the veneer and stuff, we helped each other out on both of them, but really it was more the table was Dan's, the sideboard was mine. So then when I got to grad school, I wasn't really sure what I would end up making, and I was actually a little nervous about this whole thing because I knew I had these pretty badass skills coming out of North Bennett Street School, but I also knew that those weren't going to get me anything as far as the conceptual content and as far as making art. So my biggest crisis in grad school, I would probably have to say, was figuring out what do I do with these skills. And so what started happening for me is, because we were required to take some art history classes as part of our MFA program, I took an early American decorative arts class. And what happened was I was studying forms like this, which were very familiar to me from the work that I had done at North Bennett. So at North Bennett, I was looking at forms like this and studying them structurally. But what was happening was now I was learning a lot more about the historical and social context of the forms, and I felt like I was learning American history all over again through these objects. So suddenly the Hadley chest came up again. But what became really interesting to me with this form that I was so familiar with already structurally was what these pieces of furniture had been made for or used for. And so, like, I remembered hearing about the Hadley chests, hearing about this quirky carving and maybe speculation on where that where the motifs from that carving came from, and that it was a little bit mysterious, and there was this area in Massachusetts where all this furniture came from, and there were a few different joiner shops that it came out of. But what I didn't remember learning about or hearing about was that most of the Hadley furniture all revolved around the idea of marriage, and that this was dower furniture, and that it was built between about the years of 1650 and 1720 in western Massachusetts. It came out of like 4 or 5 different joiners' shops. It was a very homogeneous style, and it stayed in fashion long after this sort of Puritan style went out of fashion elsewhere, like areas on the coast. If you look at chests that come out of Ipswich around the same period of time, the Thomas Dennis chest, the carving is very different, and they're much more sophisticated chests in a way as far as the decoration and stuff is concerned. So these were sort of old-fashioned. But another interesting thing about these chests is that many of them have these initials on the front. And I don't know if you can see in this slide, but on that center panel are the initials RD. So in most of these initialed Hadley chests, they're thought to have been dowry chests that were made for young women in the region. So I became really fascinated with this idea that these chests were made for young women to use. So they were basically made for a young woman to fill with the contents that she would be taking with her from her father's house into her new husband's house. And these would be maiden initials that were carved on here. And often these were passed down through the female lineage instead of through the male lineage. But because all married, well, for the most part, laws started changing in Connecticut, I think, before anywhere else. But for the most part during this time period, once a woman got married, anything she owned became the property of her husband. So as far as the probate records and everything, these chests and other objects like this are all recorded in the documents left by males. So even though this chest was most likely made for a young woman whose initials were RD, we don't know who RD is anymore. There are several women who were in the area at the time that we can sort of speculate this belonged to, but we don't know for certain who RD was. And that kind of stuff became really fascinating to me. So what I did was this chest is actually owned by the Chipstone Foundation, and it was housed at the Milwaukee Art Museum at the time, so I could actually go visit the chest. So I don't know how often they had done this before, but I was used to going to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and getting to have hands-on experience with the chest. So without a whole lot of convincing, John Prown was easily willing to let me do that same kind of thing with this chest. Of course, there were curators there with gloves on and stuff, but so I was able to get photographs, take the drawer out, lift the lid, that sort of thing, and take measurements, and then go back and make a detailed drawing of this and build the chest then. So the first form that I built was this piece, and basically all I did was leave the panels out because I was thinking about the work that would have been done by women's hands and stored inside those chests, and the fact that what we have left today are these, you know, centuries-old forms that stand empty in museums. But that if you really thought about these forms and their use and their engagement with human bodies, that empty space was actually really quite full. So I made that piece, and then I decided to move on to another form. So I decided I was going to make a Queen Anne style ladies' writing desk. But in this case, I hadn't found an exact piece that I wanted to start working from. So I kind of put a few things together and came up with my own version of a Queen Anne style ladies' writing desk, but I wasn't too sure about what I had drawn, so I felt like I needed to make a mock-up to see. I was complaining today about not knowing things like Rhino, so I'm still in the phase where my mock-ups are physical 3D objects. So I started just putting this together with Baltic birch plywood and poplar right off the bandsaw. And in my mind, this was a mock-up just to get the proportions down and to start monkeying around with that pigeonhole area and decide what I was going to do with that. But what happened was everyone who saw it would tell me, this is the piece. You don't need to make this fancy pearwood desk. This is the piece here, which was very problematic to me at the time. Because you know, I had left this right off the bandsaw. You can see burn marks on the ankles. This was a huge struggle for me. So I couldn't quite help myself in this situation. So what I did was I made one little tiny drawer using my fine skills and cut these little teeny tiny tails and pins. And see, Tony, there, the teeny tiny pins. Out of pearwood and curly maple. And then I did this other thing that I didn't quite realize what it was about for me at the time, but I have a better idea now of, I basically rendered that pretty little drawer functionless by completely enclosing it and making it a time capsule, which someone told me was actually a very mean thing to do. But I didn't really think of it that way. And to me, it actually became telling of where my work ended up going, and that I pretty much gave up function altogether for a while to explore other things. So what I did then was I went back to that Hadley chest form because I realized that that form was so rich with content, and I started thinking about that form in the same way. So I basically built a mock-up and penciled on the front the carving that was on the original chest. So it was basically like putting the layout lines for a carving there. And because I felt like I was now reclaiming this form as my own, so it didn't make sense to put RD on there. So I put my own initials and just left it that way. And I also there was something about pencil marks on wood that was really attractive to me. and I wasn't quite sure what that was about. I didn't show here the first piece that I made in grad school, which was actually kind of an homage or a little shrine to my father, who's a carpenter, and it was a little Japanese print stand that it was based on a Japanese print stand that Frank Lloyd Wright had made, and then where the print was on the Frank Lloyd Wright piece, I put a chunk of 2x4 that had my father's pencil marks scrawled all over it, and if you looked closely, you could see where he was figuring out stair treads. But anyway, I realized that pencil marks on wood were really familiar to me, and there was something to explore there that I wasn't sure about yet. So the other thing, or one of the other things that I was really intrigued by in those chests is that those were built at a time when when cabinet making hadn't been established as a specialized area yet. So joiners were making both furniture and houses. And those early Hadley chests were riven. The construction was fairly crude. And it was very much like house construction. And also, if you thought of what they were used for in a way, it was almost like a little house that a woman could move into another house with all of her belongings from her previous life. So I decided to make one of these in framing lumber. So this was just 2x4s, and then again, pencil scrawled on what would have been, I guess, floor joist or something. And so what I scrawled on here was just quotes that were taken from letters that my grandfather had written to his children that were very religious in their original context, but if you took the religion out, because I was no longer religious, they were just really sound advice on how to live a life in service to one's fellow men. Men, women, man. So that I started realizing also what that scrawling on wood and that the connection of marking on wood to building in any form. And then I just started exploring the form with different materials. And also what happened was when I made that first decision to take the panels out, the form started referencing other things. It looked more architectural and more house-like. And this was just, I was thinking about how important the facade or the front of those chests is, that all the effort was put in that carving on the front. And so this piece came out of thinking about that idea and thinking of if it was just that front facade and it was set back into a wall space. And then once I did that, it started looking sort of cubby-like or taking on, it started reminding me of that pigeonhole area in the ladies' writing desk. So I added the little scroll work elements, and that's where I started realizing that eventually these forms could actually have a dialogue with each other as well. And that's just, this is the back of that piece, and because of the way I had constructed it, there ended up being these little compartments that weren't used, and somehow I didn't want to just cover those up. So, and there's a history in furniture of having these secret compartments, so I left those accessible from the back, which, you know, was just mostly a little fun thing for me to do. But it actually, that move that I made actually ended up informing later work. And that's something I find really interesting about this process too, and how I went from this really rigid training at North Bennett Street School to actually learning how to work more intuitively with this material, which I never imagined that I would find a way to work intuitively with wood. But that did start happening in the way that something that I did to one form eventually informed something in another form, became a really exciting thing for me. Another thing that also took on this sort of cradle or crib structure just by taking those panels out. So this is just, you can't quite tell from the photo, but those openings go all the way through. So from the front, you can see right through that piece. And then this was an installation of all the various forms that I had done based on that Hadley chest. And then this piece actually was in that same installation. Just if you turned around, it was in the other half of the room. And this was actually a collaboration that I did with my father. That first little 2x4 chest that I had made hadn't quite done it for me. It hadn't, the idea of the structure being house-like and using framing materials hadn't, just the 2x4s didn't do that well enough for me. So I decided to actually build a piece for my father that became sort of a navigation between his skill set as a fine carpenter and my skill set as a furniture maker. And it was a really interesting process and exercise to do with him. We've actually made this piece 2 other times, and it's been really funny because each time we build it together, we have the same arguments, and we like get hung up in the same places. And the first time, I couldn't quite communicate to my father what it was I was trying to do, and because I'm not a carpenter, and I don't know the same lingo, and I don't know the same process exactly. I mean, I did learn how much furniture making is related to carpentry. Carpentry is just bigger on a grander scale. The tolerances are different, but you're doing the same kind of thing, actually. So to watch my dad like square up a wall with his tools is really fascinating to me. So what I had to do was have my brother draw what I had conceived in my mind, because I could get him to understand what I was trying to do, that it was basically structurally based on this chest form, but 3 times the scale, and then built the way you would frame a house. So, you know, it's not exactly the scale, not the exact proportions, because we were limited to framing lumber. But once my brother drew that, then that gave my dad an idea of what we were trying to do. But what this piece did too was really hammer home for me how much that investigation of the Hadley chest had become a personal investigation for me around issues of identity, like gender, and the fact that my skills were very male identified, not just because of the history of furniture making, but also because of the history of my own family, that all the men in my family were taught carpentry skills, and it didn't occur to anyone to teach me those skills. It didn't occur to my father. It also didn't occur to me. So it wasn't until later, after I had left home, that I acquired some woodworking skills outside of his expertise. But then bringing ours together also brought up the idea of that in some sense, although I did not learn them from him, they feel in some sense inherited. So I'm dealing with inheritance both in my vocation and then in my ancestral inheritance, thinking of early America and the European ancestry and the women's work that's connected to these furniture forms that I think about. Someone went so far as to suggest that what we had done was built my father's womb. But that's, I can't remember if I ever actually told him that, but I don't know what he would do with that information. I think it's already the fact that he's implicated in work that you could argue is feminist in certain ways. That in itself is a funny thing to me. What was that?
Like a womb of one's own.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is that first piece that I had made in the quarter sawn oak, housed inside of that larger chest-like structure. And then this is just a different installation view of a stack of these chests in a different group exhibition. And the stacking them up for me also was an interesting thing that first came about because I was running out of room in my studio. So they started getting stacked in the studio, but then I realized that that was also referencing things that took on this totemic quality, and also there's a history of, if you look in the back of museums in their storage rooms, you'll often see furniture stacked up, and it's stored that way, plus the idea of a kind of lineage that was building on itself. So then I turned back to the ladies' writing desk form, and what happened with that is it became even more abstracted into this almost caricature plywood version of the form, which was another huge crisis for me. Simply cutting out and brad nailing plywood together it probably was one of the best crises I had. I remember I hadn't actually used a nail gun that much, and so when I was starting to put these together, I wasn't very good with the nail gun, and you know how frustrating it is to shoot nails out the side of something or out the back. Because the first little mock-up version that I made, you know, I was just using whatever scraps I could find in the shop, and so I was using, you know, stock that was way too thin, and it was hard. So I remember telling one of my fellow grad students, I said, I feel like a charlatan. You know, I can hand-cut dovetails, and I can't use a brad nailer. But his response was, that is probably exactly the crisis you need to be having. Which I think was true. And another thing was using color, like painting wood was really, initially it was really uncomfortable for me. Then I completely embraced it, and this, so this piece, I really want to have a video of this, because you can't see, but this little figure is hinged. And when you spin that little knob on the top, he flails about kind of like a whirling dervish. And just an interesting side note, that robin's egg blue color came about from actually from thinking of a robin's egg. And when I made this piece, I was thinking about both the whirling of the little figure and the idea that, you know, dervishes whirl to a state of ecstasy, spiritual ecstasy, basically. That and the idea of the first experience I can remember, the first memory I have of feeling like I understood beauty was of finding a robin's egg as a child. And it turned into this traumatic experience because I took the egg out of a nest because it was so, I mean, I still remember like thinking, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life, and taking the egg and then being told later on by my mother that that was not a very good thing to do, and that now the baby bird wouldn't live, and I couldn't put it back because the mother would, you know, that whole thing. So I was very distraught about this, and what I ended up doing was smashing the egg on the driveway. So, I mean, when I think back to that experience now, or that memory now, I have no idea how accurate my memory of this event is. But I think of it as being about the idea of seeing beauty, feeling like I understand beauty, and not being able to have it, or not being able to contain it or hold it, or something about that tension. So then eventually this turned into a whole series. So this was my MFA show in 2007 at UW. So it turned into 9 of these. And what I was thinking about during this whole process was memories from my childhood, like that robin's egg memory that had this sort of suspended quality to them, like they were suspended in time, and they were stories that I've retold to other people or told to myself over and over, and I have no idea how accurate they are. I mean, some of the things I tell my mom can't remember. happening, but that they still have become these ways that I make sense of who I am today. So it had to do with memory and child's play and sort of my adult relationship to those childhood memories, which partly also came out of thinking of this ladies' writing desk form, which one of the things that fascinates me about those desks is they're so different from the forms that were built for men to use at the time to keep writing and documents and stuff. You have these big bookcases on desks and these big secretaries. And then these ladies' writing desks are so diminutive that they almost look like somewhere in between adult furniture and children's furniture. The scale of them is very strange. And then that whole pigeonhole area seems almost like a place for fantasy and play. And so there were just various versions of this. And then what else happened was when I built the first one, I realized that the way that I had put it together had left these sort of spaces I'm waiting for one that accesses those spaces, so that was actually my hair from a lock of hair that the first time I remembered having my hair cut, which was this weird, I had long hair for so long, and I think I was so identified with having long hair that I was scared to get it cut, like I didn't know who I would be anymore, or something like that. Just weird sort of childhood. So opposite that broom then is just this little slit in the side of the case. So that's where I started thinking about that Hadley chest form I had made, where I had accessed those enclosed spaces from the back instead of closing them off. So, and again, here's that sort of intuitive, being able to work intuitively with the material. When I first built this form, I just put it together how it made sense, and it wasn't until after the first one was built that I realized, well, I've created these spaces in here that I could actually access. So then eventually I built more consciously accessing those spaces. And then after I graduated, as I said, I stayed on and did a master's in art history because I was doing all this historical research. Anyway, I kind of wanted to take that to another level and actually do some serious writing about the stuff I was researching and the way that I was starting to interpret these forms, because I also felt like there is a real lack in the scholarship, especially with forms like the Hadley chest or the ladies' writing desk that were made to specifically be used by women. The historical scholarship that goes on around these objects still stays, for the most part, in the realm of male production. So we're very invested in who made these objects, tying them back to a particular shop, or the materials, the tools that were used. And there's very little discussion about the idea of women actually using these forms and putting things inside of them. And like when I was spending a lot of time with the Hadley chest form, like I started so I lifted the lid on that Hadley chest a lot, and I started realizing like where on my body, right below the waist, where that lid hit. Things like that I started realizing there's a lot to these as far as the actual physical engagement with the human body, and we tend to not think about that when those forms are just standing empty in a museum. So I was asked then by Chipstone, they were going to do an exhibition of 3 contemporary artists whose work in some way referenced the past. So I was really fortunate to be in this 3-person exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum in the spring of 2009 with Beth Lipman, who's a glass artist. It's Lippman, I think, and Sarah Lindley. Both of their websites are, it's sarahlindley.com and bethlipman.com, and they're amazing. Beth is a glass blower, and Sarah is a ceramic artist. And they were both making work that referenced, well, with Beth's, her pieces, her hand-blown glass pieces reference Dutch still life, 17th century Dutch still life paintings, so she recreates in hand-blown glass these Dutch still lifes. And then Sarah Lindley's work, she was doing this, the work in that show was these full-scale slab-built porcelain structures that referenced Dutch cabinets. So very furnitural. And well, I'll talk a little bit about the whole show after I show my pieces. So I went back to the Hadley chest form for one reason, because the actual Hadley chest was on view again at the Milwaukee Art Museum around the corner from this gallery. So this is the installation that was called Lineage that I had in that show. So I revisited, this was that original, that very first Hadley chest that I had made where I just left the panels open. And I was never completely satisfied with that version. Originally I had poured live yeast in the bottom and let it crust up and dry, sort of, you know, the idea that there had once been something living in there. But I didn't really like, I wasn't that happy with that. So eventually I went back to that piece and how I resolved that. And this came out of thinking more and more about the women's textiles that would have been stored in those. So eventually this piece became just filled with folded and stacked antique linens that my mother and I had collected over the years, and then my mother had to start doing a lot more collecting to actually be able to fill this piece. And then this piece, so it's quarter sawn red oak. The interior is dyed with aniline dyes, and then I actually I stitched this linen slip cover for it, basically. And I constructed the front of the slip cover the same way that the wooden chest was constructed, with the same members. And then I taught myself one simple embroidery stitch, and then embroidered the carving from the original chest onto the front of this. So it was kind of like taking a line that was incised or cut into a surface, probably, most likely by masculine hands, and feminizing that simply by stitching it instead and bringing that women's work to the outside of the chest. And then in this you can kind of, I think you can see the little figures and the bottom rail and the middle rail. This is something I plan to investigate a lot more, but there's another thing that goes on with these chests is that, well, or with this one in particular, is there are these quirky little figures carved onto the front of it. There's one on the drawer as well in between those. And there's one other Hadley chest that has figure-like motifs on it, but they're not quite as fully developed as this one. And I can't find anywhere anyone talking about these figures, and they're really quirky. They look like little aliens. They, to me, they also look like perhaps there could possibly be a Native American inspiration for those, for the carving as well. It can't be traced back directly to a European motif. So the carving on these chests remains kind of a little bit of a mystery to people. Supposedly there was carving on a meeting house in Hadley, Massachusetts that had this same carving, and there's speculation that it came from Europe. But it's sort of been left alone now, and I also just find fascinating that there are these quirky little figures, and I can't possibly be the only one wondering what exactly they're doing there. So, I mean, they easily, it makes sense to think of it, there are 3 of them, so it makes sense to think of them as representing family, because these were objects that were exchanged around marriage, so they're dower furniture. But so what I did for, that's just a detail. What I did for the 3rd piece then was a stack of these chests, stacking with the fabric hanging on the inside, and by this time I had started doing some collaborative work with a friend of mine, Shel Isaac, who's a Madison-based artist, also graduated from UW, and she does a lot of video and sound work. So I commissioned her, well, it sounds weird to say that I didn't pay her, so I don't know if I can. I asked her to make this video to be projected on the front of these chests. I'll just go ahead. This is just going to run through the video a minute. I'll take a little break from talking and let you guys. And it deals with those, the motifs from the, so I gave her my drawings for the embroidery, and she basically scanned those into the computer and then animated them. But then was also thinking about my idea of these 3 little figures and perhaps how to interpret them. And I just wanted to pay a little homage here to one of my favorite furniture makers, and partly because I've always loved this chest of Christina Madsen's, the Darner chest, but it wasn't until, I don't know, a few years ago, I think, that I realized that she was also doing something with textiles in this piece that I wasn't, maybe I was aware of when I first saw it, but not until later when I actually had conversations with Christina about it specifically. And what I loved about where my work has gone now and investigating the textiles, and actually now to the point where I'm able to sort of bring those into my own work and start revisiting textiles again, is once I acquired my woodworking skills, I felt like I should somehow be combining those with my textile past. And the only way I could think of to do that successfully was like to make my own fabric for upholstery or something, and that just seemed very forced and contrived. So eventually, after some unsuccessful attempts, I gave that up. But now I realize that the textiles have come back in through the back door, sort of. So it's really exciting for me to have that background and that textile history, which is partly where I started out as an artist, come back into the work. And Christina, actually, for those of you that aren't familiar with her work, she, on a Fulbright, went and studied carving in the Fiji Islands with Makiti Koto, who's a master carver there. And at the time, I don't know what's happening in the Fiji Islands now, but I think this was in the 80s when she did this. It was still the case that only men carved there. So in the city, Christina could sit and carve with Makiti and the men, but even when they went out and visited the villages, she couldn't carve out in the villages and had to put on a skirt and be very womanly. So in this piece, one of the things that Christina did was to take an embroidery pattern that she learned to crochet as a child from her aunts, and translated that into lines that she could then carve using this very masculine identified carving technique. And then the Darner chest idea references both the little dragonfly that you see on the side panels and on the bottom drawer, but also the idea of Darner being related to needlework, which is why the dragonfly is named that, because its body resembles a darning needle. So now I'm just going to quickly show the form that I studied for and that I did a lot of research and writing on for my most recent master's thesis, which is a federal period ladies' sewing table or ladies' work table, which Chipstone happens to have a version of that and it's not on display in the museum, it's actually in the house. And one of the great things about Chipstone, if you're ever in the Milwaukee area, is you can go to the mansion where they house all the things that didn't make it into the exhibition, their exhibition space in the Milwaukee Art Museum in their Americans collection, and you can have hands-on time with these forms. So I spent a lot of time with this lady's writing desk, this lady's work table, sorry, a lot of lady stuff. And again, this was a form that I knew of from my days in North Bennett Street School, and a couple of my friends actually made work tables while I was there. And I vaguely remembered hearing that they often had this fabric bag hanging below them that would store women's needlework. But the two that were made when I was a student there, they just made the wooden furniture part. They didn't add the bag. So when I saw this piece at Chipstone, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. They had those weird bags there. And a lot of the bags don't last because they're fabric, they're textiles that don't hold up to the elements the way that the wood does. So the bags that we see are this is a reproduction. So in museums, if you see a bag on a table, it's most likely a reproduction, if they bothered to make the reproduction. And sometimes they may not have made a reproduction, and you may not even be informed that there was originally a bag hanging there, and you would have to be, like one of us who gets down on our knees and looks up underneath the furniture to see that there was a little frame under there that the bag would be hanging from. So I also found fascinating not just this form, and that there's this very strange udder-like sack hanging under these, but that also it kind of gets left out of the history in a way if it's missing. And again, that idea of the actual use of the form, and the idea that a woman would likely sit down at a chair or a sofa and pull this up next to her and use that drawer, does the actual use of that and engagement with that form of a female body doesn't often get talked about. And another thing that I find now the camera to be a very useful tool in studying objects, because I think the fullness of that bag, I don't think really registered completely with me until after taking this picture, I got home and started flipping through them and looking at them on the computer screen and just seeing how full that bag looked.
So that's that little knob on the side, you grab that and pull it out sideways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like this. So again, getting this hands-on experience with these things, and I was able to pull up a chair and sit next to this thing and pull the drawer out and put something inside of it and think about what it would be like for a woman to actually reach her hand down inside of that, and the idea that this is this is a drawer-like, but it's so different from a wooden drawer, a stiff, rigid wooden drawer that fits inside of a case, that it hangs out there in the open, right? And it has the malleable fabric, has the ability to change shape, right? A full bag is going to look a lot different from an empty bag, and then it could sort of give clues to what's inside, perhaps, as the contours changed.
And it's like drawers.
Yeah.
Women's drawers.
Yeah, like women's drawers. Well, and the fact that you can see the inside and the outside at the same time. And again, like taking this picture helped me think about that. So then I also started thinking about the needlework that was being done at the time, and although those tables were made for adult women who were probably no longer stitching these samplers, which were stitched by schoolgirls, but these samplers were very much an educational tool for young women to teach them to read, to teach them the needle skills that were necessary for their future lives as wives and mothers, and then also these crazy phrases and verses that were stitched on these samplers. Things that, if you think about it, there were girls as young as 7 years old stitching these lines about virtue and about death and the afterlife, and sort of preparing them for their future roles, which one of the main roles, right, was childbirth, which was very precarious, and every time a woman faced childbirth, the likelihood of premature death was greatly increased, and women would write letters on the eve of childbirth that sounded like the letters men wrote before going off to war. And then also thinking about the needlework in the home that women would be doing, that adult women would be doing, and then also thinking about other objects in relation to the form that could perhaps help me think about that. So women's dress, and thinking about the way, from the waist up, the dress accentuated the female form. From the elbow down, you've got bare arms, and the breasts accentuated by this little ruffle. But then from the waist down, right, it's just pleats and gathers, and left sort of a mystery as to what's under there. And thinking of the table with the bag as almost an inverse of the gown. And then thinking about things like women's pockets from the time. So pockets hadn't been incorporated into women's dress yet. So they would wear these pockets under their skirts, tied to their waists. And looking at, like, I loved finding this. Most of the pockets have these floral patterns on. But this one, right, the pockets have these slits in them that you could reach a hand into. But then right at the bottom of the slit is this fabulous hot air balloon with these concentric. So, and I'm not trying to suggest something pornographic, or because if you think about the relationship to women's bodies at this time, it was a very different. Childbirth was very much a part of daily life. It was still a very mysterious world to men. They were pretty much excluded from it, and it was the whole process was mostly dealt with by neighbor women, relatives, and midwives. But still, it happened in the home. It happened often. It was very much a part of the daily life and death cycle that people lived with. So the idea of this use of women's bodies was very prevalent and understood in the culture. So referencing women's bodies in forms or decoration was not necessarily the same thing that we think of today. And then I found this fabulous form that was made. This was actually made in France, but again, telling of the thinking of women's bodies. And this birthing machine, there were supposedly hundreds of these made by this Madame de Coudray, who was a midwife who was hired by Louis XV to teach midwifery skills to the rural women of France to help curb the infant mortality rate, which was really high. So she made these fabulous soft sculptures that were life-size and could simulate childbirth, so that these rural women who for the most part couldn't read could actually have a physical thing to learn childbirth skills, midwifery skills with. So when I found this, of course, I was really excited because I had already been thinking of that form metaphorically and its relationship to women's bodies, not only in their engagement with it, but that fabric drawer, that sack hanging under there, and the idea of reaching down inside of that and storing the fruits of women's labor in that sack drawer. So I'm imagining that this is basically the placenta, and there's only one known birthing machine around, and it's in this the Flaubert Museum of Medical Science in Rouen, France, which I hope to see someday soon. So I couldn't help but pair that then with this work table, because this is the only work table that I've been able to find an image of where the bag, the fabric bag, supposedly the original fabric bag, is fully intact. I've seen some images that the New England Historical Society has, but the bags are in tatters. So that gives you an idea of the way that I start thinking of these forms. And I haven't, so next is to build a body of work, thinking about the ladies' work table or sewing table. And then Shell Isaac, the woman who I had make the video for me on that stacked chest of drawers, stacked Hadley chest that you saw, she and I have started doing a lot more collaborative work together. And in fact, in this residency that I'm doing in San Diego right now, she drove out here with me, and she stayed for about a month, and she's going to come back at the end, and we're going to do an installation together. So we do these installations that are multimedia installations that involve sound and projection and a built objects or environment of some sort. And this was one of the first pieces that we did together after, it was the result of a workshop that we took at Anderson Ranch that was taught by Susan Working and E.G. Crichton? Who E.G. is a video artist and Susan is a woodworker, and they've done collaborative work together, and they were teaching this workshop. So as soon as we saw that, Shell and I were like, wow, that workshop was made for us. So what happened was we drove out to Anderson Ranch, and so our road trip out there actually became part of what we ended up thinking about conceptually. So taking on the idea of the mythology of the American West and this constant need to recreate that or reenact that, and the whole push westward, that migration, and how much that seems to have to do with American identity. Although our relationship to it is very nostalgic and problematic in a way, and very masculine, and that we have these fixed images of what that is based on popular culture. So part of what we do is we've started questioning those ourselves, and also trying to question in our work the fixed images. And this was just the very beginning of that. And while we were at Anderson Ranch, there was actually a farm rodeo going on. So we ended up taking a lot of footage of that. And it turned into this sort of almost religious kneeler with a video monitor inside. So you would have to kneel down on this thing and look down in there to see this very intimate video. It's called 8 Seconds, and it turned out that when we went to the rodeo and started shooting film, Shell was taking this really low cropped footage of the bulls in the ring. And I happened to, at the same time, without talking to each other, be taking very similar footage of the bull riders behind the ring. And so in dialogues about that and thinking about the rodeo, we came up with this piece. And then behind this was a more panoramic projection from inside the rodeo ring when this was installed, but we didn't have very good installation shots, so I didn't include those. But then we went on to do a piece called Promised Land that was sort of playing with the idea of Cinerama and the old iconic Western film When the West Was Won, or How the West Was Won, I think, which was done in this cinerama, I think it's called, which is a technique where they actually took the footage with 3 different cameras, and then it was projected they built special theaters for it. I think there's only one still in existence, and it was supposed to be the new thing in film that was going to keep film from dying out because television was taking over. But it didn't really last very long. But so this piece was dealing with all those ideas about the American West and identity, and where my own work overlaps with this is in the I'm still exploring that, but mostly in thinking about identity. And then this work thinks about American identity in particular, and questions our sort of fixed notions of things. And one of the things that we did then was Shell and I drove out to San Diego from Madison, Wisconsin, and took 2 weeks to do this road trip, and thought of it as part of our investigative research, and talked to a lot of different people along the way. And we followed one of the traditional wagon routes, the Santa Fe Trail, which went between Independence, Missouri and Santa Fe, which at the time was still Mexico, part of Mexico. So instead of being a migration route westward for pioneers, it was actually a trade route. So we're thinking about the migration west, but then we were also thinking about the exchange north and south, and the current climate around issues of immigration and this idea of Americanness, and if we even know what, if we even know today what that exactly means, and questioning that, and questioning a nostalgic relationship, because if you go back to the earlier meaning of nostalgia, it's actually describing a mental disorder, which is a longing for a home that never really existed. They started using it to describe soldiers coming back from war and having this very disoriented sense of longing for home, but not recognizing home or not knowing what home was. So Shell and I will be doing an installation in San Diego in May, based on the investigation that we did on our trip out here, and then also time spent in the desert recently. And we have, I listed the website there because we have sort of a travel project blog, if anyone's interested in checking it out. We had quite an adventure on the way out here, which in a funny way renewed my hope in the American people, and I have this strange sense of patriotism that I never expected to have at this time. And it was partly because it partly comes out of seeing and experiencing such a contrast in actually meeting people in a road trip across this country, and the exchanges that we had with strangers, and sharing stories, and the generosity that we received from people we were willing to sort of open up to, and what a contrast that is to what we read about and see about and hear about in the media. I mean, I almost felt like these were two separate worlds that I was dealing with, and yet they're not. And then there's all of this stuff going on in Madison, my town, right now too, as well as around the world. So it was just, it was actually a life-changing trip for me. And I think it also has to do with things that I started talking about in the very beginning of this talk, and the idea that I feel like we're headed towards some paradigm shift, and that the craft world, because of its connection to utility and this humanness that it carries with it. I recently heard Glenn Adamson talking about craft objects for the 20th Century European Design Show that was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and he was talking about the affection, like how affectionate those objects that were handcrafted and that are tied to utility are. And that's something I want to think a lot more about, because I think it has to do with a lot of stuff. Like Russell brought up the whole DIY movement that's going on, and I don't think that's a completely separate thing. I don't think that's just accidentally happening right now. I think we know something that we don't. I think we know something that we don't yet know yet, and I think that, I don't know, I think it's a really exciting time to be working in craft. I think craft has a whole lot to offer, especially today. So I'll end with that. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to.
Where did you actually come across the early machine soft sculptures? I'm just curious how you stumbled across them.
I was. There's a woman who teaches in the art history department, Jill Cassad. She does mostly contemporary, modern stuff. But she's also a photographer, and I can't remember exactly what I was talking to her about, but I was sitting in her office, and she said, "Oh, you need to read this essay on 20th century wetware." Wetware, yeah, it's written by, I think it's Jessica Riskin. I can give you the information on the article or send you an email with the link to it. Yeah, wetware is this term being used to, I guess it started being used in Silicon Valley to distinguish the human brain from software, but it's thinking about the connection between the two. So she wrote an article about what she feels is a similar way of thinking in the 19th century, where what became important was not just to mimic things that the human body did or that animal bodies did, but to actually simulate them. So there were speech machines being made, and they didn't just talk, but they operated in the same way that our vocal cords, everything. So it was important that it be simulated. So there was another example of like a duck that was an automaton, right, and the legs moved. But there was a difference between something just moving and being able to mimic action and actually simulating the actual way the action took place in the human or animal body. So I get this article, and I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then suddenly this birthing machine appears. Yeah, it's like, oh my God, she hadn't told me that was in it. But I found it really fascinating that that was the first time I had ever come across that. And I talked to friends of mine who are in medical school, friends who are studying gynecology, and they had never come across this thing. There's a biography of Madame de Coudray. I can't remember who the author is right now. I've only read little snippets of it, but I think it would be a fascinating read. Shoot, there was something else that I thought of in relation to that, which I can't remember right now, but.
I have a question about, or I'm kind of curious about, if you feel that there are, I guess it's in regards to the masculine, feminine identity, and in your woodworking skills, do you feel that there are any feminine characteristics in the woodworking? You went to the stitching to view femininity in some of the pieces, and so in the actual woodworking, is it all masculine?
Oh no, not at all. I meant when I said that I feminized the line simply by stitching it, I was really referring to the historical tradition of those things, that needlework has been, even though for centuries needlework was done by men, needlework has become very feminized, and it's related to the inculcation, I mean, throughout history, American history anyway, it's related to the inculcation of femininity and identifying femininity. I mean, it's interesting that if you're interested in that stuff, there's a really great book by a woman named Rosika Parker called The Subversive Stitch that talks all about femininity and needlework and its relation to femininity. And she points out in there that, you know, by the late, when was it? I guess it was by the late 1800s. So by the end of the 19th century, Freud has actually determined that needlework is no longer such a good thing for women because it contributes to symptoms of hysteria. Because they get lost in thought. And two, there becomes this this trope of the seductiveness of the woman at her needlework, you know, sort of lost in thought. So no, I mean, when I'm making those divisions about femininity and masculinity and stuff, I'm mostly talking like historically and traditionally that those existed. And I mean, for the most part, woodworking still is a pretty male-dominated field, although there are plenty of women woodworkers. And then in my own family, there's just that connection to not being taught those skills because I was a girl, and so it didn't occur to anyone.
So what's your dad's thought about that, as far as like looking at how skilled you are and how far you've come as a woodworker? Does he regret not showing you more as a kid?
I don't know if he regrets it, but when I ask him about it, I mean, I've joked with him before. He's told me that I swing a hammer like a girl. To which I reply, well, I am a girl, Dad. And then I say, I'm a girl who wasn't taught when she was 16 how to swing a hammer like her brothers were. You know, and he'll just chuckle or, I don't know. So I don't think there's necessarily a sense of regret. And I don't know that I have. Sometimes I feel regret about it. I mean, it would be really handy to have those carpentry skills. But I also wonder if I would be doing what I'm doing now if I had learned to swing a hammer when I was 16. And my guess is maybe not, so. But I don't know, I don't know fully what my dad thinks about all of this. He's intrigued by it. We have conversations about it sometimes, but mostly he just thinks it's fun to do stuff with me.
I mean, don't you feel in a way that he has influenced the way in a direction you've gone? I mean, here you are. If he was a tea maker or right?
Yeah.
Could you think that you would have?
No, I think that was part of it too. I mean, I didn't realize this at first, but eventually I realized that one of the main reasons I think that I turned to wood, I mean, I found it beautiful, and I was blown away by your chair, Tony, and by Michael Hurwitz's chair, and by the things that I was seeing, and that connection of those three chairs. But I do acknowledge that I was also paying homage to my father and his skills and that tradition, that lineage, and a sense of inheritance, feeling like I somehow inherited hands that had the dexterity to work with materials in this way.
More so, right? I mean, much harder to do.
Well, he will tell me that he could never do what I do, that he wouldn't have the patience to do this. But at the same time, like, I realized that the building furniture is related to building in general in a bigger way.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.